Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, David Austin, and today we have a very special guest. It's Professor Don Womack, who is a professor of music composition at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and we welcome you to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Let's talk a little bit about your first experiences with music.
Okay.
Did you play an instrument as a kid? Were you...
Yeah, I came from a musical family. My mother was a singer, and my older sister was a singer. And so they started me on piano and so forth. And I would have to say I was a failure at piano early on. And I don't really play much today. But that got me started on the right path, yeah.
And in what respect? I mean, were you just you just didn't like practicing, or you didn't like playing or performing, or?
Yes, all of the above, basically. It just wasn't what I was interested in as a 7, 8-year-old kid. You know, we'd be out running around playing ball and all that kind of thing with all the other kids.
So how did you fall into composition? If you weren't so inclined to
Right.
play an instrument, you know?
Well, I kind of came to my senses years later, and really in late high school, early college, I was not intending to be a music major or study music profession with an aim to be a professional or anything like that. But I did. I wanted to be a rock star, I think is what it was.
Yeah.
And so I kind of started writing some things, rock song type things, and eventually one thing led to another, and I found that I was more interested in doing strange and unusual things with the music rather than writing pop songs or anything.
Interesting.
So that's sort of what started me in the path to becoming a composer and really thinking about the music that I wanted to write.
In other words, it was the invention kind of aspect
Right.
of music making that really attracted you.
Exactly. It was the creation of it more than the performance that interested me.
What did you listen to when you were in college? What sort of sparked this kind of like, because if you start off writing rock songs, that probably was your musical
Right.
lexicon, right?
Exactly,
How did that
yeah.
translate to classical music?
Well, earlier on, you asked me about my earlier experiences, and I did. I can remember as a pretty young kid, 7 or 8 years old, cranking up things like Beethoven's symphonies
Right.
on the stereo and having it play through the whole house and just kind of running around and dancing to it,
Right.
and so kind of falling in love with it in that way. But later on, in college in particular, I kind of, as I said, I was more interested in a little bit more complex music, and so I started to move from listening to pop music like every other kid to like the 70s art rock groups like Yes and Pink Floyd and so
Yeah.
forth, and it's more complex music, and from there it was one step after another, and I eventually sort of discovered 20th century classical music that way.
That's very interesting. And to this day, I mean, when you put on the radio, what do you put on? Anything? Or
I rarely listen to the radio, to tell you the truth, but I listen to KHPR.
Okay.
That's pretty much it.
But if you were to even put something on the in the CD player, on the record player, what would you put on?
Depends on what I'm listening for. I mean, a lot of times I'm listening for professional reasons. I'm listening to keep abreast of what's happening in new music, or I'm trying to understand how a piece works or something like that. So I'll listen to a lot of contemporary music that way. Just for enjoyment, I listen to jazz. I like rock still. I'll listen to those, Yes, and King Crimson and Pink Floyd and groups
Right.
like that. But I'm more interested in kind of a crossover between those. I think some composers nowadays are combining the rock characteristics with classical,
Yeah.
traditional developmental techniques, and that interests me a lot too.
There seems to be a lot of bleed, especially with electronic music. How you're beginning to see a lot of rock influences, and classically trained composers writing electronic music, and non-trained composers also writing electronic music. It seems to be sort of that kind of an interesting mix.
Yeah, I think you're right.
When you started composing, who were your main influences? I mean, your teachers. Who were your teachers in college?
In college, actually, as an undergraduate, we did not have a composition program, so I was a theory major, music theory major,
Okay.
and I just kind of composed on my own. In graduate school, I studied with Bill Carlins at Northwestern University, and Alan Stout, and J. Allen Yim, and Amnon Woolman, and Michael Pizarro.
Okay.
So I had kind of a mixture of teachers there. In a lot of ways, though, I consider myself self-taught because not to diminish what those teachers gave me because that was important, but
Right.
I feel like I really learned to compose and to find my own voice after I was finished with school.
That's interesting. How was composition taught to you?
kind of the same way that I teach it to my
Right,
students. I mean,
sure.
that's a difficult thing to get your head around. How do you teach composition? And I think that you can. Some people say you can't teach composition. Actually, I think you can. What I think you can teach is the craft of it, the technique, very specific things. Oh, you want this to sound loud here? Well, this is what you need to do. If you're going for a delicate texture here, this is what you need to do.
Right.
The aesthetic of it is the thing that's difficult to teach, and that's something that every composer has to come to on their own, basically, to find their own distinct and personal voice. No way that I can give that to my student, just like there's no way my teachers could have given that to me.
And in some ways, it's almost like you're handing them a toolbox of sorts.
Exactly.
You know?
That's a great analogy, and that's one that I use with my students all the time. I talk about the toolbox. What's in your toolbox? And they're struggling with a particular passage or something, and I'll say to them, well, you don't have that tool in your box. Let's work on that. And I'll give them an exercise to develop whatever it is, the technique that they're trying to do. So yeah, I definitely use that toolbox analogy.
How important is it that they listen to music? I mean, that obviously has got to be important. Does it kind of expand their palette a little bit?
Absolutely, yes. And that's one of the most important things, especially for young composers just starting out. I will constantly be giving them pieces that they need to listen to. Oh, you need to know this, you need to know that. You need to know Ligeti, you need to know Barrio, you need to know John Adams, you need to know Corigliano, you need to know the Beethoven string quartets. Yeah.
Right.
Everything.
And it's music reaching back as far as Beethoven. It's not
Absolutely.
just who's alive now or
Absolutely.
recently dead, but yeah, back
Absolutely.
that far.
Yeah, I mean, for my students, we will talk about they're having an issue, a challenge in a particular passage or something, and I'll say, let's see how Bach handled that.
Right.
Let's see how Beethoven handled that. I mean, the language that they're using is different, but the basic idea is still there.
Right. That's very interesting. You know, drawing on such a wide vocabulary to sort of work through these specific problems that come up in their compositions. And do they then just come to you with a set of scores each week, or is it, you know, do they get an assignment from you, like you need to write, you know, the first half of a piano sonata this week? Is that how you do it? Or?
It depends on the student. With the undergraduates, and especially the ones who are beginning, I will be much more hands-on, give them specific parameters. This is what you need to do. We're going to write a 2-minute piece for piano and violin, and it's only going to use this scale, or very specific types of things, because they're just beginning, and I'm trying to get them to do some basic skills.
Right.
By the time you get to graduate students, PhD students, pretty much wide open. So I'm letting them choose their own aesthetic, and I'm basically trying to support and help them create the best piece that they can within the aesthetic that they choose.
How many composition students are involved in the music department at UH?
At UH right now, we've got probably 18, 20 composition students mixed among the undergrads and the grad students.
That's pretty, incredible. There are 20 living, breathing composers living here in Hawaii, you know, waiting at the supermarket in the checkout line with everyone else. That's
actually more than that. Those are just the students. There are actually quite a surprising number of professional composers here too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just on the UH faculty, and also composers who have retired from UH who are still around.
Oh, interesting.
Very good composers, and there are also some composers who are not affiliated with UH too. So,
but they just like to live in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Huh. That's very interesting. Let's talk about some of your compositions. What would you, if you were to give someone one work that you've written and say, this is sort of not necessarily the greatest thing I've done, but is typical of me, if there is such a thing, what would it be?
That's a really hard question to narrow it down to one. I'll give you two.
Okay, perfect.
Probably my magnum opus to date is a large-scale double concerto for shakuhachi koto and Western Orchestra called After. It's about a 35-minute piece, so very large piece. And it was written as a response to the Ehime Maru incident, the sinking of a Japanese fishing vessel by a U.S. Navy submarine in 2001. It was commissioned for a 2006 performance by the Honolulu Symphony as the 5th anniversary of that event as a memorial. And although it was inspired by that event, it really transcends it. It's basically about grief, about the process of humans dealing with grief. And so it's a very dramatic, emotional, in a lot of ways neo-romantic piece, but combining Japanese instruments and Western instruments, which is something that has been of great interest to me.
Right, as you know, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, there's a very interesting synergy, I think, in your music between Japanese and Western instruments. Yeah. How when you're writing a piece like that deals with a tragedy like that incident, how do you translate emotions like grief into what you're writing?
Boy, that's a loaded question there. I think that you draw on hundreds of years of music that are ingrained in our culture, and have really become not just Western culture, but world culture in a lot of ways, through dissemination through TV and movies and film and so forth. There are certain gestures and sounds and harmonies and melodic figures and so forth that have certain characteristics. So you see this in film music all the time. Good film composers will immediately be able to trigger an emotion in you by writing a certain harmonic progression and so forth. So in some sense, I draw on that. I definitely am trying to avoid cliches and not use things that have been used before. But I think that in general, the way that going back to what we were saying a minute ago, I will tell my students how did Bach handle that idea? If you look at how Bach would translate tragedy, general things like it's going to be slow, it's not going to be fast, and things like that are still very much a part of music today. And I think there's a basic human psychological construct that allows composers and other artists working in other genres to connect with that human psyche. To create that emotional
And
effect.
that's interesting because you said that it was almost like a cross-cultural thing. Like, for example, we've had, Western music, whether it be pop music or classical music or jazz, in our ears ever since we were kids. And some kid in, Mongolia has probably had a very different sort of like lexicon or music in their ear, and how it's something that actually is translatable. Like, sad music sounds sad in lots of different cultures.
Yeah. In not all, but in lots of different cultures, And again, I think a lot of that has been mitigated by the exporting of American culture, which is basically movies and TV. So there's a large percentage of the world's population that has been sort of ingrained with that culture.
When you were writing that piece, were you ever concerned that because I think that when you write about, or when one writes about anything sensitive, like I think about a lot of the pieces that came after 9/11, right? And how I've heard some pieces that are a little bit on the, like, I hate to say, but the kind of like hokey side, that they kind of push the envelope too far, taking such a terrible, tragic incident, trying to translate it into the music. What were some of the challenges you faced with that?
Well, definitely I didn't want to over sentimentalize it.
Right.
And I didn't want to create something that was sort of whitewashing the issue. Whether we're talking specifically about that incident, the Ehime Maru sinking, or whether we're talking about the larger issue, which is really the basis of the piece, the humans dealing with grief. There's not a happy ending to it, but at the same time, we move on.
Right.
So, and I think that I was successful in that piece with creating that feel of there's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of drama in that piece, back and forth, trying to deal with things. And at one moment it seems like it's hopeless, and other it seems very hopeful. And I think that that's what the experience of grieving is about. There's this wide swing of emotion. And I think that I was successful in capturing that effect in the piece. And the end just kind of peters out. It goes on indefinitely. The grief will always be there, but you learn to deal with it.
Has that piece ever been performed in Japan?
It has, actually. Last year it was given its Tokyo premiere by the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony.
And was the reaction to the piece different in the United States and in Japan?
Not all that different. I think it was very well received in both cases, actually. It has not been played outside of Hawaii in the U.S., so that's a different thing, because in a lot of ways Hawaii is not like the rest of the U.S. So I wonder, that's a good question, I wonder if it were played in Chicago, if it would have the same kind of response. But here there's such a close connection to Japan that I felt like the reaction was very similar to what I got in Tokyo.
Absolutely, and it was such also, I think, from a political perspective, it was a very challenging moment in U.S.-Japan relations, right? Because here we had something that was perceived as an accident, but there were civilians on the American submarine, and it caused a lot of tension, I think. And how did you deal with that?
Well, I had a couple of advantages there, one of them being time, because I wasn't writing it immediately after. This was 4 or 5 years after that I was working on, so I had the benefit of perspective. And the other is that I don't like to be overtly political with my music. Instead, I tend to lean toward the human experience.
Right.
So what I was after with this piece was not trying to place any kind of blame or anything,
Right.
but rather let's just see what happens to the human beings who are involved in this. And from my perspective, I was thinking not only of the victims of this incident, not only being the Japanese,
Right.
but also, there were Americans in there who, frankly, some of them screwed up.
Right, sure.
But this causes problems for their lives too, and so
Absolutely.
they're dealing with the grief. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's the kind of thing that nobody wins from this kind of thing.
Right, right, and seeing beyond the politics of the situation to look at the human beings involved with that. That's
Exactly.
that's one of the most tremendous things that music can do.
Yeah.
Is to help us examine our own humanity and how we
Humans
examine
make
things.
mistakes, and we deal with it.
Exactly. How do you think history has informed music?
That's another good question. I think in the late 20th century and the 21st century, musicians, composers, and especially artists, really, of all kinds, have become much more self-aware of their place in history in a way that had not taken place in previous historical periods. So this whole idea of postmodernism, for example, is about, let's just say, composers. It applies to all artists, but let's just keep it with composers. It's about composers becoming very aware, when I write that sound, is that going to sound like Bach? Is that going to sound like Beethoven? I can't do that. But I can tweak it a little bit to kind of poke fun at Beethoven.
Right.
So that kind of attitude. I think that we've gone through a period, and I think we're kind of coming out of that period right now. There were a lot of postmodern pieces which dealt with quotation, either literal quotations from earlier pieces or stylistic quotation. And I think composers are less and less interested in doing that sort of thing today. I think there's kind of, looking at it now, I think a lot of composers think it's a little bit cutesy sometimes.
Yeah.
So for me, that doesn't interest me all that much. Some composers there have been some really great postmodern pieces written, don't get me wrong, but I think that a lot of composers now are looking at other ways of approaching their work.
Do you find that writing music, you oftentimes feel like the weight of history on your shoulders? Like if you're about to write, say, like you wrote a violin concerto, do you think, oh man, I have to think about like Brahms and Beethoven and all the great violin concertos? Do you
Absolutely, yes. And again, much more today than in previous historical periods. If you look at Shakespeare, for example, in his time, it was completely normal to not only not have to worry about being derivative of another author, but hey, you could just lift something from their work,
right.
Not a problem. Today we're very much aware of that sort of thing, and I think that this is really a Western cultural concept too, which has become more of a broader concept in the world. But yes, you have to be very aware that what you're writing is unique and original and distinct and not derivative of something that has come before. And as you say, the weight of the world, the weight of history is on your shoulders when you do that, because it's hard to come up with something new.
Right, I was going to say, it must be very difficult because there's been so much music written, and frankly, because of the way that music can be disseminated now, we've heard a lot of music. Like I can go onto iTunes right now and download any one of 50 different versions of the Beethoven symphonies, for example. We have access to all of this stuff, and it just seems like you wonder. I would be curious to hear how. Have you ever found yourself writing something and then thinking, oh, wait a minute, I heard this before, and then you realize that you're inadvertently copying something else? Or
you catch yourself sometimes, and it's hard to come up with something new, because you like it, but no, you can't use it.
You're right, sure. That's very funny. Do you find it when you're writing? Do you find it harder to write for a chamber ensemble or for a large group of instruments?
I think there are different challenges for both. I think, frankly, it's hard to write for anything, big or small. I enjoy writing for orchestra, actually. I've written quite a lot of orchestra music simply because there's so much that you can do with it. There's so many different instruments that you can draw, and so you would rarely encounter a situation where you've got everything going and you need something else and you don't have it, which you might encounter in chamber music.
Right.
With orchestra, you can pretty much do whatever. On the other hand, I consider writing for orchestra kind of like driving a truck, whereas writing for a chamber ensemble is driving a sports car,
Sure,
because you
right.
can be so much more nimble with
Right.
it. So yeah, different challenges.
It also strikes me as being kind of scary when you only have four, say in the string quartet, only have four voices. You know, you've got to make everything really just so.
Yeah.
You know, very
Got
interesting.
to make it all count.
Do you use technology to help you write music? Do you use computers and stuff?
Yes, I use a notation software called Sibelius, which is it's not really designed as a composing software, but I find it useful to help me compose. So I do not use things like Pro Tools or sequencers or that sort of thing,
Right.
real advanced technology. I don't need that. Basically, I input into the computer, it will kind of play me back a rudimentary robotic kind of performance, but it gives me a good idea of how it's going to come out. That's how I use technology, yeah. But I also think that I still use paper and pencil to sketch out some ideas. I still use piano to play through ideas. I think that all of those, in a sense, are technology. Going back to the idea of a toolbox, those are all different tools that you can use. And depending on the job, if you want to hammer that nail in, you don't use a screwdriver, right? So if there's a certain passage that I need to hear, it's very intricate rhythmically, the computer is very useful for that, because I can't play it back.
You don't have
but
6 hands
the
to do it.
computer,
Yeah.
So you use the right tool for the job, yeah.
And a software like Sibelius is more like a word processor is to a writer.
Absolutely.
You're just simply entering things so that it looks nice, so that you can and you can kind of move things around.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great analogy. With a word processor, it's very easy to. I want this paragraph after this one. You can just do that. And same thing in Sibelius. This passage here. What if I put it over here? And you can experiment with it that way. So it's a great tool, yeah.
I bet it really changed the way composition happens in this world too.
Definitely.
But you can go a lot faster.
Yes, it does. I think. Yeah, it makes it easier. I'm sure if Mozart were living today, he would be using some kind of software like that too. It just makes your life easier as a composer.
What do you think about, because you talked briefly about this, what do you think about computer-generated music or electronic music?
I have, when I was 20 years ago, when I was in grad school, I did some electronic music. It wasn't really for me. I didn't create stuff that I found all that interesting. I think there has been some good music created that way. I think the difficulty that composers of electronic music have is that they not only have to write great music, but they have to, and spend their time honing the technique to be able to do that, but they also have to spend an incredible amount of time with their technique of utilizing the technology.
Right,
and
sure.
so it's basically, to my view, it's twice as hard in that way.
Right.
So I think in a lot of ways it's more difficult to create really good music with electronics.
That's interesting, like the machine has made the process somehow more cumbersome.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Is it difficult, do you find, to compose for non-conventional groups of instruments? Like, for example, I noticed that in a lot of the pieces that you've written, you've done things for orchestra, but they also have, a koto in it and a shakuhachi or some different, a great example, I think, maybe you can talk about this piece specifically, is the piece that you wrote for violin and, was it violin and shakuhachi?
Koto.
Koto, that's right, violin and koto. Why do you pair certain instruments together?
Different reasons for different situations. In general, if I've got, if someone is asking me for a piece, then that's usually the best reason to write something. And in this particular situation, I was writing for two specific performers, a violinist and a koto player.
Okay.
But to get to the question, is it more difficult to do that? Only in the sense that you have to kind of learn how an instrument works. So koto in this case, if I had never written for koto, the first time I wrote for koto, I had to go about learning, what works on koto, what doesn't work. That, on the other hand, is really no different than writing for violin, because the first time I wrote for violin, I had to learn what works for violin, what doesn't work for violin. So the fact that an instrument is a non-Western instrument really doesn't make any difference. Every instrument, wherever it's from, has unique characteristics, and basically you write to those characteristics, write idiomatic things that will sound good for it.
Did you have to listen to a lot of koto music?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
And I worked with the first piece I was writing. I was able to work with a performer, and actually that piece I was working very closely with the performer. I was in Japan at the time. And so I got a lot of good tips. I'd bring something in to show her, and she would play through it and say, you know, well, maybe if you did it this way, it'd work a little bit better. And oh yeah, okay, that makes more sense because it allows your fingers to flow more naturally, but it still gives me the effect that I'm looking for. So yeah, it's when you can work with a performer, it's a really good thing.
Did that sort of happen when you worked on your violin concerto?
Yes, I wrote that for Iggy Jung, who's the concertmaster of the Honolulu Symphony. And I worked closely with him on that. I would take passages into him and say, "What do you think?" And he would say, "This is impossible," and then he'd do it.
Right. Yeah. That's terrific. That's terrific that you know, to have those relationships with performers. Do you find that you cater pieces to their personalities too?
Sure. And to their playing strengths, you know. So if you've got a performer who sounds really good playing lyrical lines, then I'm going to write lyrical lines for them, you know. If I've got someone who's really can play fast and, you know, with great technique, I'm going to write those
More
kinds of
technical
lines
music,
for them.
Why Japanese instruments?
Basically, I think that the way it happened was that's where I had an opportunity to work with. So as I said, the best reason to choose any instrument that I'm writing for is that I've got an opportunity to write a piece or somebody's asking me for a piece. So the way it worked out is that I simply had an opportunity to work with these performers. And that the first piece that I wrote, there were a couple of Japanese performers who were actually the ones who played the concerto after.
Okay.
But that led to meeting many more performers and a larger ensemble that they work with. And so now I've got, I don't know, 10 or 12 performers in Japan who I can write for.
That's terrific, and it must also have expanded your, you know, the textures that you're able to use, because non-Western instruments, I think in some ways they're similar to Western instruments, but in some ways have very, very different, you know, timbres and tones. So they sound, you know, you listen to Japanese instruments and they sound absolutely, you know, you could pick them out as being Japanese instruments.
Right. Yeah, and again, you write to the strengths of the instrument. So I would write for, you know, basically what works for the instrument.
Is there an instrument you would never write for?
There are many instruments that I haven't written for. I don't think that there's one that I would unequivocally say I'm never going to write for that instrument. If there's an opportunity, I'll write for it. You know, find something interesting for it to do.
And did you? I'm very interested actually in how you blend cultures, because are you from Tennessee?
Tennessee originally, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about some of your more, I guess, traditional, like, American type music. Let's talk about Blue Ridge Dreams, for example. How did that end up? How do you sort of almost like rationalize that with your interest in Japanese music? Because it's like Tennessee and Japan seem to be very, you know, almost like Arkansas and Japan, just like very far apart from each other.
Yes,
you know?
They are literally and figuratively very far apart. And growing up in Tennessee, you know, I never would have thought I would have an interest in Japanese or Korean or Chinese instruments as I do. But that specific piece came out of, again, a commission, a group, a duo, actually, a strange duo called Bridging the Gap. It's violin and bass. So kind of you know, the far ends of the spectrum of the string family there.
You're missing the letters B through X.
But they were terrific players, really hot players, and they asked me for a piece. So I wrote them this piece. And they're based in Washington, D.C., so, and they have connections in the Shenandoah Valley, so I kind of was writing for that and drawing on my heritage. And having grown up in Tennessee, I actually played bluegrass when I was growing up. I was a bass player.
Oh, terrific.
And so I kind of drew on that heritage and wrote them a piece, which is basically bluegrass, but not bluegrass. It's bluegrass with a twist. So how does that connect to my music for, say, Japanese or Korean instruments? To me, they're very much the same style. Even though on the surface one sounds more Japanese or one sounds more bluegrass, underneath the style is very much the same. Basically what I do in the case of Blue Ridge Dreams is take the surface level sound of bluegrass, but then manipulate it with developmental techniques typical of the late 20th or early 21st century classical music. And so it creates this kind of reference to bluegrass, but it's not really bluegrass. It sounds like bluegrass, but it's not. It's bluegrass with wrong notes, if you want to think of it that way. And very much the same thing in my music for Japanese instruments. You asked me a little while ago if I could pinpoint a piece that was the epitome of my style. And I gave you one. The other one, I said I'd give you two. The other one is a piece for Japanese instrumental ensemble, 10 Japanese instruments. It's called Walk Across the Surface of the Sun, and it's basically Japan meets 21st century classical music meets rock and roll. So underneath, again, on the surface, it has a particular sound. The sounds of Japanese instruments, a koto sounds Japanese. No matter what you do to it, it sounds Japanese. A shakuhachi is the same thing. But what I do with those surface level sounds is it takes them to a different place that is not Japanese.
Right.
So that's the connection between a piece like that and a piece like Blue Ridge Dreams. On the surface, it's using a particular sound, but underneath, it's the development of that sound that is what I would call my style.
And that's you, yeah. That's so fascinating because just listening to you talk, it's like, it's almost like listening to all of your music, and you provide a lot of music for me to listen to before we spoke. It's almost like I kind of knew you before we met. Like it's very biographical, and now that you're filling in this with narrative, it's very interesting to see. You know, you grew up in Tennessee, and you know you had an interest in Japanese instruments, but at the same time, the music is still very distinctly you. You can tell that regardless of what I listened to, that it was written by the same person. You know, it's very, very, very interesting to me because I think that oftentimes doesn't translate to people just listening to music. You know, they don't understand like how writing music can be, you know, personal that way, you know, and human that way.
Right. Where's the individual in the music?
Right.
And if you listen deeply enough, you'll find it.
Yeah. Do you ever feel that when you get a commission that you're somehow constrained by the people giving you the commission? Like, in other words, do you feel like, for example, if a certain group says, I want you to write me a piece of music, well, you know, I want to write something that their audiences will like, or that the performers will like playing. I mean, not even constrained in a bad way, you know, because you want to write something that the performers will like to play. How does that kind of, especially specifically the commission, you know? You know,
ironically, most of the time when I get commissions, it's the exact opposite. I'm asking them what they want, and they're saying, just write something you want to write. And I'm thinking, you know, I want more parameters because actually it's easier for me if I have parameters. You know, Stravinsky very famously talked about how the creative muse is much more likely to strike if you have more limitations. Because if you're looking at a blank page and anything is possible, it's almost paralyzing, right? So for Stravinsky and for me too, I like to have some parameters, some limitations. I can't go over here. I can't do that. Instead, I have to stay right here because that's going to spark the creativity more easily. But you know, most of the performers who have commissioned works have been very open and generous and say write what you want. So you know, in a lot of ways, that's actually more constricting for me. Ironically,
Do you ever get stuck?
Yes.
And what do you do to get out of it?
Good question. I wish I knew the answer. I'm stuck right now.
Are you?
Yes. On the piece that I'm working on, I've been stuck for 2 months, and I just can't break the ice on it. What do I do to get unstuck? It's the thing that gets me unstuck, and this happens often. I frequently get stuck. Starting a piece is the hardest thing to do. Finishing is the easiest thing to do once it gets going, but getting it started is hard. So I very frequently get stuck. And what I do to get undone, there are little tricks I'll do. I'll try listening to lots of music is usually the best thing. But the truth is there's no magic trick to it. Usually it is a matter of just sitting down for a few days, a few hours every day, and just forcing something onto the page. And being in agony and thinking this is just awful. And it's, you know, you work for 20, 25 hours of this. And then finally there's one little motive in there that, oh, okay, now I can make something with that. Let's throw all this other stuff away. So it's really, as Beethoven said, you know, inspiration is, or what was it, creativity, composing is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. So it really is like that. And it's not the inspiration that precedes the perspiration. It's the other way around for me. The perspiration creates the inspiration.
Do you write like Beethoven, where you'll take a long time to come up with, say, the beginning of the Eroica Symphony, just 2 big E flat major chords? Is that how you compose, or is it more like you just sit down and write like Mozart?
No, and that's a really good comparison there. Those are kind of the two extremes. Mozart, who I like to think of, you know, he could basically turn on the faucet and the notes would come out. Beethoven was, you know, turn on the faucet and there's a little drip and he would struggle to get somewhere else. So I'm definitely much more like Beethoven in that regard. I have a very hard time coming up with ideas. Once I have a good idea, I can go with it for miles and really develop it and take it places. But getting that idea is really hard for me. And it's interesting because a lot of my students are just the opposite. They'll come in one idea after the next, but they can't do anything with it. Right?
Sure.
So I'm like, can I have that one?
Do you find that putting things on the shelf for a while helps too?
Usually not, to tell you the truth. When I put something on the shelf, it's probably not coming back.
Interesting.
And there have been only a few times when I've had to do that, when I really just could not break through and write that piece that I wanted to write. But the few times I put it on the shelf, I haven't come back yet.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So there are just a limited number of times when you've actually had to like abandon, say, when you're about to write something. I mean, do you also have a series of what is your process of composing? You know, like let's say you have a commission to write a piano sonata. What would be your first step?
First step would be to try to squeeze some information out of the performer. What do you want from me? You know, what do you want this piece to be? And hopefully I'll be able to get some parameters that will help me narrow it down. In any case, coming up with those narrowing down of parameters, very basic decisions like, how long is this piece going to be? Is it going to be a 2-minute piece? Is it going to be a 2-hour piece?
Right.
You know, those right from the start, those are very different things, and you have to decide that early on. You can't just start writing notes and think, okay, well, this is going to go wherever it goes, and it might be 2 minutes, it might be 2 hours, because it just doesn't work that way. It's going to be a different idea if it's a long piece versus a short piece. So basic things like that. What is the character of this piece that I want to write? I tend to, not always, but very often have some sort of extra musical idea, some sort of image or poem or a picture in mind that I try to kind of capture the essence of that in music. That helps me. That's narrowing down the parameters for me. So I try to come up with something like that for it. So composition, the process, to write a piece is literally making hundreds of thousands of decisions. And those first few decisions are usually the most important ones. They're going to they have the biggest impact on the final result. So that's how I start. And then, as I said, I go through this period where I'm, on the ledge ready to jump. And I will get pulled back in at the last moment and, finally break through. And once I get the ideas going, it usually flows pretty well. I like to come up with a sketch, like a sketch couple of pages where I've got 3, 4, 5 good ideas. And once I've got that, then it's like a puzzle, putting the pieces together. Actually, and that's another analogy I like to use for my students in particular. Composing a piece is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, only you have to make the pieces.
Right. And it's almost like when you're at that stage, like you've got several like signposts in the piece, and then you're sort of trying to make sense, bridging one to the next.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. A lot of young composers try to they think you start in measure 1 and you go straight through to the last measure. And for most people, it doesn't work that way. Some can do that. But like you say, these signposts, if I know what I want, how I want it to begin, I know what I want to happen here, I know what I want to happen here, I know how I want it to end, then I can connect the dots, and it's much more easy that way.
Do you ever start with the end?
Often, yes.
Like how you want things to...
Yes.
You know the conclusion, but you just don't quite know the introduction.
The end is much easier for me than the beginning.
I'm also very interested as an early music fan about the work you did with the Viola da Gamba Society of America. Now, gambas are not played, they're played in early music ensembles, but they're not really in orchestras anymore. I think they're really cool, in case the audience doesn't know. They're almost like cellos in various sizes with frets on them. Why are you composing for violas da gamba?
Again, the opportunity comes along, someone commissions a piece. So I connected with this group from Japan, actually, ironically, a viola da gamba group in Japan. Very good group, the Yukimi Kanbei Viol Consort. And I wrote a couple of pieces for them, and one of them happened to win this competition from the Viola da Gamba Society of America.
That's really cool. What were some of the challenges of writing for an instrument that just really isn't played anymore?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge would be getting performances of it, because there aren't a lot of ensembles. But if you were writing out of the blue without contact with performers, that would be a very difficult challenge.
Right.
But luckily, I had this group that wanted the piece, so they have performed it many times. Actually, a couple of pieces they performed many times.
That's terrific, because it's you're bringing quote unquote modern music to a really ancient instrument that didn't have anything written for it between say 1750 and like probably now. That's really incredible.
Yeah, a couple of centuries of a hole in the repertoire.
Right.
But a lot of composers actually are interested in early music now, and there's an interesting, natural connection, I think, between early music and new music.
Yeah.
And a lot of early music groups also do new music. And again, with this couple of centuries missing in the middle, they'll do the early stuff and here. But I think aesthetically, a lot of new music is much more similar to something from the 13th, 14th century than something from the 18th or 19th century.
Isn't that interesting that a lot of composers often say, to me when I talk to them, I don't like to listen to anything after Bach and before Stravinsky. It's like this like Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and all of Rachmaninoff, all of the guys that get played so much by orchestras, composers. Maybe we're just sick of hearing them or something. I don't know, but that's very, very interesting. And I think that for a lot of people who listen to a lot of music, listening to music that's written by living composers and music that's written by really, really dead composers, like Palestrina and those guys, you can definitely see the parallels. And I think, especially because at least when I was growing up, this kind of music wasn't played so much. Like when I was a kid learning instruments, like I didn't necessarily listen to viol consorts, and I didn't necessarily listen to a lot of music written by living composers. And maybe it's just that I got sick of listening to Beethoven, but that's, I think, at least what I gravitate towards now. So.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason it's called the Common Practice Period, right?
Right.
There's this period of about 300 years that the vast majority of classical music performing organizations program nowadays, and the stuff before that and the stuff after that gets sort of short shrift sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm always so disappointed when an orchestra will take the modern, I've discussed this, the modern piece and stick it between the overture and the symphony that's on the second half of the program, so that people don't get up and leave because they're and I think that's sad, because music written by living composers is just so important. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of having a performing organization here in Hawaii, because I think oftentimes, and I've talked a lot on the show about the Honolulu Symphony and its unfortunate state. Can you explain, as a composer, this is a definitely loaded question, how important it is to have a modern symphony working here in Hawaii?
Yeah, as a composer, it's extremely important, not simply to have an orchestra to write for. That's important too, but really much more important than that is to have available performers to play chamber works, for example. So to have really, really good performers in town. And, we really do have, when the symphony's up and running, we really have good performers here, really top players. So I have been blessed personally to be able to write a lot of music for these people who can really play. If we don't have the Honolulu Symphony in town, we still have some in town, some of the musicians in town, but that's not going to last forever if there's not an opportunity for them to make a decent living, by playing in the orchestra. But I think it goes beyond that. For me, obviously, it's very important, but I think it's important for the community to have an orchestra for the same reasons, not just so they can go hear the Honolulu Symphony, but so they've got these musicians in town who are professionals at the top of their profession, who can play for other situations and give chamber concerts and that sort of thing, but also teachers. These are teachers, So if you want your kid to be able to study with a really good professional, experienced performer, the Honolulu Symphony is the reason for that person being here in town. And without that reason, we're eventually not going to have those people in town. And I think that the community as a whole will suffer. And I think that the community will notice it too late.
Yeah, I agree that the community will notice it too late. And I think that a lot of the problem is sort of a misperception of artists and composers as being these sort of aloof figures that don't have kids that play baseball and they that go to this times or whatever. What do you think as a composer? Do you ever for example you go to meet your kids' friends' parents or whatever, and they say, "What do you do?"
Mhm.
You know, when you say, I'm, you know, probably say I teach at University of Hawaii, but when you explain that you compose music, how do people react to that?
I think most people find it a curiosity. Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. You know, it's kind of, uh, I mean, I don't want to read too much into it, but I think buried underneath it, in some ways, is I thought composers were dead.
Right, sure.
So yeah, I think people a lot of times are surprised
Mhm.
to find that I'm a composer, and it's kind of, how do you do that? Where does your music get played, and that sort of question.
Mhm. What do you think your role is in society as a composer? You know, because some people have very obvious roles. You know, doctors
Right.
cure sick people. You know, academics study stuff to make society a better place. You know,
Yeah.
what does a composer do? Do you think that's unique?
I think very similar to any other artist. Basically, the role of the artist in society is to hold up a mirror to society on the one hand, and to help us take a look at what our society is, but also to sometimes provide a beacon for what society can be, what we can aspire to. You know, if you talk about any great city in the world, for example, what are the things that you talk about that city having? You talk about its art, its architecture, its symphonies, its
Absolutely.
musicians. These are the things that define a society, you know.
And this is absolutely why actually we're doing this show, Think Tech Hawaii, on the arts, because that's exactly what we're trying to sort of get across, I guess, is that that's terrific. You just summed it up for me. You know, that as Honolulu's future and as Hawaii's future, really Hawaii's future, the arts are an essential part of our role in global society. You know, do you think that you as a composer hear things differently?
Definitely. Yes. Are you thinking specifically of music?
Yeah, well, music, or even of just, you know, I always think about that movie about Glenn Gould, the 32 short films about Glenn Gould, and I think he's in a restaurant or something. He's listening to two conversations that are happening around him, where, you know, the average person would just hear two people, you know, two different conversations, but he actually hears music in
Yeah,
it.
as counterpoint.
Yeah, yeah. Do you find that you do stuff like that?
Sure, I think I hear things a little weird sometimes. Yeah, a lot of times I'll hear something and I'll kind of, oh, that's an interesting sound. And I'll look around to see, did anybody else notice that? You know, nobody else noticed that. But to me, it was interesting because it was a strange timbre, or it had some weird relation to what was going on around it. So yeah, I think I've never really thought about it, but I think you're right. I probably do hear things a little differently.
Do you hear a lot of melody? Do you write a lot of melody?
I wouldn't say my music is overtly melodic. I think there is melody in my music, but that's not really the focus of my music. I think my music tends to be more focused on a couple of elements. One is that are kind of in opposition or kind of balance each other out. One is rhythm. My music tends to be very rhythmic, very energetic and driving, and these sort of layering of different rhythms on top of each other to create this interesting texture. And in balance to that, a lot of my music is very, very lyrical, I think. And I usually create that lyricism not so much through melody as through harmony and through the sounds of the kind of creating a bed of sound that is lyrical.
That's a very interesting idea, because I think that a lot of music that we've been trained to view as good, you know, whether that's right or wrong, is melodic music, you know?
Well, I mean, if you think about, again, music from the common practice period, how do you identify a piece from the common practice? You sing the tune, right? You sing the theme.
Absolutely.
So that music for, you know, several centuries was primarily melodically based, and that's kind of where we get that from.
Do you think that music is going more, is returning to that direction, or do you think that it's because, you know, I think, like, for example, like something like 12 tone or serialism is kind of like not so hip anymore, right? And that people are kind of going more towards, like you were talking about, like, you know, having a rhythmic basis to it, or having a textural basis to it. Do you think that that melody is coming back, or?
Yeah, I think, I don't know about melody in particular. I think that music is becoming much more accessible, certainly.
Right.
There was a period in the mid 20th century where composers honestly didn't care if you
Yeah.
listened to their music or not,
Sure.
which just strikes me as very odd. If
Right.
I'm writing a piece of music, I want people to hear it. I want people
Right.
to appreciate it, to enjoy
Right.
it, to be moved by it. And I think that's a pretty common attitude among composers today. Most composers, not all, but most composers are writing music that is meant to be listened to.
Right, sure.
That somehow makes a human connection.
Right.
I think that's a very important thing.
Isn't that interesting? And it doesn't necessarily have to be pretty music,
No.
but it's something that's evocative,
Right.
you know?
That can somehow move you. And move you may mean that, oh, that's the most beautiful thing, but it may also disturb you.
Right.
You know, and again, the role of an artist in society sometimes is to disturb you, to kind of shake you and say, look at this, you know, something's not right here. What can we do about it? So I think that some music, it's important that some music does that, yeah.
What do you have on your plate right now?
This piece that I'm stuck on, which is a piece for pipa, which is a Chinese lute, and viola and guzheng, which is another Chinese instrument, which is, if you know what a koto is, this is basically the Chinese version of a koto. So yeah, I'm trying to get that piece going.
Do you write one piece at a time?
Usually, yes. I have had students. I had one student a few years ago who could write 3-4 pieces at the same time, and each week he'd come in for his lesson. I didn't know what he was going to bring because he was working on all these different and very different styles. I can't do that. I have to focus intently on what I'm doing, get it right, finish it, and then move on to the next thing.
How many hours a day do you write?
I wish I had a consistent answer to that. Just the nature of my job and my life, you know, with my kids and my family and all, and the teaching responsibilities, administrative stuff that I have to do. Sometimes I will go weeks without finding any time to compose.
Sure.
Once I get going on a piece, though, I can go 8-10 hours a day on it for a very intense period, finish that piece, and then kind of take a breather and catch up on email and everything that piled up in the meantime.
That's so interesting, you know, because it's a job that it's almost like, you know, you're running your own business in a lot of ways, you know, where you have some degree of flexibility, but I'm sure you have deadlines too. You know, if you have a piece that's going to be premiered on a certain date, you know, you have to make sure that there's adequate time for it to be rehearsed and to get feedback from the performers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's really, you know, very, very fascinating to me, because for those of us with, you know, kind of standard 9-to-5 jobs or 8 to midnight jobs, but, you know, 9-to-5 jobs, you know, you know, your schedule is pretty much set, but when you're, and I'm sure, like, as you said, you're stuck right now on a piece, and when that happens, you probably spend less time, or you have to do that big push through.
Yeah, actually,
you know?
I can't just put it aside. It would be nice if I could kind of put it aside. Oh, okay, I will work on all these other things that I've got to do that aren't composing. And then when I'm ready, it will be there. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It's a matter of actually consciously working on it until I finally break through. It's really like having a big stone wall that I just have to keep pounding at with the pickaxe until it finally breaks through.
What do you like the most about teaching?
I like the most when students are really into it and they get excited, and you can see that they're learning and they have those aha moments. That's really nice, and that's really quite inspiring for me when I see that happen. Yeah.
Do you encourage them to continue on with composing as a career?
Yes. I mean, it's different for every individual. I'll tell each student different things, what I think their best chance of success is, right? With some, yes, definitely you have a chance to have a professional career as a composer, and you should do this, and that. Others, I might steer a little different direction. Maybe you want to go into teaching, you know, high school band or something like that.
Sure.
Again, I try to find what I think the student can be successful and happy with.
Right. And that probably isn't just a function of raw talent. It probably is also a function of temperament, too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Your personality will predispose you for certain types of activities. Yeah.
What personality traits do you think are important for a composer to have?
The ability to sit for long periods of time in complete isolation and aesthetic despair.
Yeah. That's very like romantic, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that romantic stereotype of the composer sitting down at the piano and just improvising this beautiful symphony, you know. Sorry, it just doesn't happen, right? So it is really, composing is a very, very time-intensive activity.
Yeah.
that you just have to sit there for hour after hour after hour and work on it until it's right. It would be nice if I could just go in and work a couple of hours and the piece is done, but it simply doesn't work that way. So I think that some people don't like to be alone like
Yeah.
that. For me, I'm a little bit of a hermit, you know, I'm introvert, so it suits me very well. But it's interesting when you're working how you lose your perception of time. Lots of times, like I said, 8, 10 hours, that'll go by and it felt like maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, and
Yeah.
I'll look at I didn't eat anything today, I didn't, you know. So you really lose yourself in the work.
Do you find it tough living in Hawaii as a composer?
I love living in Hawaii. I mean, just for my life in general, Hawaii is a wonderful place in many, many ways. As a composer, I think there are certain disadvantages to being here in terms of if you're trying to, you know, make a name for yourself in New York. Well,
Sure.
you're not in New York,
You're not
but
in New York, right.
but that's not just Hawaii. If you're in Kansas,
Right.
you know. For me, the good things about being here far outweigh the negative things. There are so many incredible opportunities that I wouldn't have elsewhere. I mean, the chance to work with Asian instruments, for example. If I were somewhere else on the mainland, most likely I would not have that opportunity. So there's been a lot of great opportunities for me as a composer living here.
Thank you so much for coming on our show. I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.